Yes. Excellent. Hawkins.
Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. What's the time? Okay. Yeah, okay. Can you please take your seats? Thank you. I will do the thing. Okay. Yeah, okay. Wait, I just want to get myself organized. Get myself organized first. I'm just like, no, but I just want to get myself very much, okay.
Are you okay? Okay, thank you very much, colleagues, and good afternoon. Excellencies, colleagues, friends, and partners that are here today to this IEJ's launch for the Debt Paper Series. We are with our partners as well, which is the Center for Economic as well as Social Rights, as well as the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. And we also have Bretton Woods projects, which is also part of our organizing organizations. And we are hosted here at the South Africa's Embassy in Washington as part of the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, which is also a partner to this event. So we welcome you here. My name is Mzwanele Ntwanti, and I am a senior researcher at the IEJ, and I will be your moderator and host for today. Low-income countries and many developing countries have been muddled with persistent debt burdens. As the debt crisis looms in many countries and development prospects diverge globally, the current international financial architecture remains inadequately formulated to deliver justice and long-lasting solutions to the challenges that we face of debt overhang, especially for countries in the global south. The ongoing global tariff war is set to worsen the debt situation, lowering export earnings for developing countries and redirecting resources from developmental objectives such as health, education, climate response, as well as resilience. The expected inflationary pressures will further tighten global financial markets and consumer demand for essential services. So today, the launch of these 3 papers is a powerful contribution that compels us to rethink how we approach sovereign debt restructuring, and not simply as a technical issue, but as a deep structural political problem, maybe also a moral question of our time. It is therefore befitting that this launch takes place on the sidelines of the IMF as well as the World Bank spring meetings. The first paper on human rights-based approach to debt restructuring invokes international human rights norms emerging from international human rights law and related soft law principles. This paper argues that a human rights framework is crucial for framing fairer debt restructuring, though it may not be necessary to confront the historical and structural context of repeated sovereign debt crisis. The second paper discusses how trade imbalances and external dependencies create conditions for perpetual debt burdens and debt accumulation and dependency, and external dependencies create conditions for perpetual debt accumulation and dependency, and provide a vision for borrowers' coalitions, explaining how debtor states can move beyond defensive debt negotiations to collective action and advanced strategies with a long-term relief vision that overcomes structural barriers. The final paper in our series offers key perspectives on how African countries can unlock development finance through a combination of finance, debt relief strategies, and new financing mechanisms, focusing on suggestive policy reforms to address the inefficiencies of the G20 Common Framework, and advocates for a shift towards a large-scale sovereign debt restructuring program that supports countries facing debt distress. So great summaries of these papers you can find in the pamphlets here. But if you want a full set to the papers, you can also scan the QR code and you'll have access to the full papers that are on our website. Or you can also visit the IEJ.org.za website, which also has a full list of the full papers. But what you have here is a set of summaries in the pamphlets. And I just wanted to also indicate that the bathrooms are downstairs. If you exit with that door and you go down, at the end of that corridor, you will find the bathrooms if you need some relief. But also, you can also find water, tea, coffee, and some cookies at the back of the same floor. I know people already help themselves, but you can also have more if you need to. And we are going to try to fix the aircon because it's a bit hot in here. But I guess the South Africans brought the vibes. So we're going to up the aircon so that we also can feel a bit relaxed. Thank you so much once again for being with us here. For those that are joining us online, we are not going to have interactions. We're only going to interact with the persons here in the room. So you can follow us on our social media pages. On LinkedIn, the Institute for Economic Justice, Boston University Global Development Center, Center for Economic and Social Rights, as well as the Bretton Woods projects. On X, we are at iej._SA, at GDP_center, social rights, as well as at Bretton Woods PR. Thank you so much, colleagues. How we're going to then have the event unfold, we will have Ambassador Ismail Esau to come and welcome us at this South African Embassy in DC. And then we will have our panelists come and present the papers we have. Ismail Esau, thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. Just a point of correction. I'm not the ambassador, actually. I'm the Charge d'Affaires. It's quite a mouthful. It's just Deputy Chief of Mission. There's a whole lot of titles, but it's Charge d'Affaires. Okay, so welcome once again. Welcome, everybody. And to the more formalities in terms of my speech, as distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. Indeed, a warm welcome. It's a warm welcome, actually. And here to the South African Embassy, and I apologize for the aircon not being in working condition, but they're working on it. So hopefully by the time that we will get into the whole midst, the aircon will work. So on behalf of the government of South Africa, it is indeed our pleasure and an honor to host you here today for the launch of the Institute for Economic Justice debt paper, held on the margins of the IMF and the World Bank spring meetings. It is no coincidence that this conversation is taking place here during the spring meetings, because what we are here to discuss today is not a side issue, nor a technical detail. Sovereign debt and the growing crisis that continues to impact many countries in the global south is the defining challenge of our times. We are especially grateful to the Institute for Economic Justice, the Center for Economic Social Rights, the Boston University, and the Bretton Woods Project, and all the contributing partners for convening the series. Their work not only diagnoses all the problems that we face, but also points to the pathways and what that is rooted in justice, solidarity, and the principles of human rights and development. We are also deeply honored to welcome Professor Joseph Stiglitz, whose voice has consistently challenged the orthodoxies and reminds us that markets alone cannot solve the challenges of development. Debt sustainability for low-income countries is one of the 4 priority areas of the South African G20 presidency this year. We recognize the G20 as a critical platform to renew efforts to tackle this important issue with a particular emphasis on Africa. The work surrounding sovereign debt takes place, for the most part, in the International Financial Architecture Working Group that is set to undertake a number of activities and discussions to advance debt sustainability as a priority. Firstly, the working group will provide an update on the state of play of local currency sovereign bond markets with the support of the IMF, the World Bank, and the other international organizations active in this field, including technical assistance and cross-country knowledge exchanges. Secondly, we aim to improve the common framework's implementation through concrete actions. This will begin with the G20 policy note to offer a stronger explanation of the common framework process for debtor countries as a start to fix information asymmetries. We aim to publicize non-confidential information on a common framework cases on the G20 and the Paris Club websites and encourage official creditor committees to work on a reference note of the technicalities related to debt treatments. Thirdly, we will host a side event on the private creditors' involvement in recent common framework cases with a follow-up discussion on the implementation of compatibility of treatment. We already arranged an Africa outreach event to borrower countries, perspectives on debt sustainability to improve the common framework. During March, the International Final Architecture Working Group, the IMFAWG, meeting the National Treasury, partnered with the Africa Development Bank to host 14 African countries who shared their experiences. Zambia, Ethiopia, Ghana gave credibility, useful insights into the experiences on the implementation of the common framework, while others share concerns surrounding the use of the framework. G20 countries found it useful to lean from the platform created for the African countries. The findings of this event will be discussed this week at the Finance Ministers' meetings. Finally, during the March meeting, member states and international organizations share their experiences on climate-resilient debt clauses and are in the process of compiling a G20 note mapping the use of this instrument on a voluntary basis, consolidating the experiences of member states. The South African government is committed to progress throughout this year. The G20 is a consensus space that will require a huge effort from all the participating states and international organizations. We look forward to the rich discussions ahead of the ideas that will emerge today. I also wish to thank all the presenters and contributors for their work and commitment to these issues, particularly the UNCTAD, the South Center, and the Institute for Economic Justice, three of our official G20 resource partners here today. Welcome once again, and thank you for your participation and all good in your deliberations for this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Esau, for that warm welcome. And we can now take off our jackets. Normally, that's what we would say at home, that you must feel at home here at the South African Embassy. We are going to just dive deep into it now and the presentations that we have today. We have about 4 presentations, and a lot of work has gone into this important work, and we really believe that your participation throughout these discussions will also contribute significantly to the work that we are doing. The first presentation, which looks at designing human rights-aligned reforms for debt restructuring, will be delivered by María Mamberti, who is a research and policy lead manager at the Center for Economic and Social Rights. In her role, she undertakes research to advance proposals to inspire fairer and more sustainable economies. And the second presentation will be by Penelope Hawkins, which will be looking towards a Global South Borrowers Coalition. And Penelope is the acting head of the Debt and Development Finance branch at the UN Center for Trade and Development, UNCTAD. As a South African economist, she has focused her research on the financial constraints of small open economies. And at UNCTAD, she brings her experience as a policy consultant as well as an academic to bear on these serious issues. And the third presentation we will get from Marina, Marques, who is at the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University, and the paper will be looking at diverting development, the G20 and external debt service burden in Africa. And Marina is a senior academic at the Global Economic Governance Initiative and leads the Financial Stability Workstream. She holds a PhD from the Freie Universität Berlin. Marina also is a co-chair of Brazil's T20 Task Force 3 on reforming the international financial architecture. And this year she's part of the T20 in South Africa. And the fourth presentation will be by Professor Stiglitz, who needs no introduction. Here, Prof. Stiglitz is an American economist and a professor at Columbia University. He's also the co-chair of the high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress at the OECD, the co-chair of the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, ICRIT, and the chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute. Prof was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in Economics in 2001. He's a former senior vice president and the chief economist of the World Bank and a former member and chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Prof. Stiglitz founded the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, a think tank on international development based at Columbia University in 2000. He's been a member of the Columbia faculty since 2001 and received that university's highest academic ranking professorship in 2003. In 2011, Prof. Stiglitz was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. And in 2024, he was named the honorary academician by the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. He's the author of numerous books, including most recently, The Road to Freedom, Economics, and the Good Society. I would like to call up on María to come and provide the first presentation. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Soanele, for the introductions to all our colleagues at IJ, the staff of the embassy, and all the organizers and participants here and online. So I will briefly introduce the paper we produced on human rights in a way that I hope will trigger a conversation among us. And as anticipated, the goal of the paper is to discuss what human rights can bring to pursue reforms, specifically around debt restructurings, and how human rights can be a tool to leverage to address the current global debt crisis. I won't focus here on the data to illustrate the scope of the crisis that is in the papers, and I think my colleagues will speak to that. But the bottom line is that 40% of the population in the world currently lives in countries that devote more to debt servicing than to health and education. And there are conversations on the scope of the crisis, whether we're worse off, better off than in the 80s. But I think that in a world as wealthy as this one, the fact that states across the global south have constrained fiscal space to address basic human rights needs should be of sufficient concern. And things are worse because this is happening while we're falling behind on SDGs achievement, while we face a climate crisis, while inequality becomes unsustainable, and where we're overall failing to address global poverty. And to make matters even worse, we don't have a system to address these problems. The scenario has been described as a non-system or as debt furniture rather than architecture, where pieces move around, but outcomes are generally the same. So in this scenario, debt restructurings, the agreements to ease the capacity of debtors to pay outstanding debt should have a prominent role in restoring debt sustainability. The fact is that this does not often happen. Restructurings are too lengthy, too time-consuming, too opaque, unsystematic, and often lead to insufficiently equitable results. So in the paper, we try to address this concern by showing how human rights principles can be additional arguments for many stakeholders, but mostly for countries in the global south, arguing for reform of the debt furniture and to pursue fair debt restructurings in particular. So this approach basically supplements ongoing efforts to connect debt, development, and climate. These are approaches that are reinforcing to one another and may be beneficial for different countries depending on their legal traditions. I see South Africa, for instance, as a human rights leader for many decades and a country that has done important work in consolidating social rights in their own constitutions and through their own courts. And therefore, this framework could be useful for a country like that. I am Latin American, and I understand that Social rights are the core of the constitutional project of many Latin American countries, and therefore a framework like this could also be useful for this group of countries when arguing for reforms. Yet, the approach is not entirely revolutionary. What we try to do in the paper is to distill a bit further things that have been advanced to some degree in the past. So if you look, for instance, at the UN Basic Principles on Debt Restructuring that the General Assembly of the UN approved already in 2015, the principle on sustainability includes in its definition the need to respect human rights. We also have UN guiding principles on foreign debt and human rights that were approved by the Human Rights Council, which overall try to connect sovereign debt and human rights obligations. So why are we trying to move forward in these processes, and what do we gain, or what's the value add of adding this framework to the conversation? Well, as I see it, there are like two big buckets of reasons to go this line. And the first one is that international human rights law in particular is a normative and stable framework. So it's not a political commitment, it's not time-bound, it's a stable framework that has been in place for decades. And because it is a normative framework, it provides some universally agreed standards against which to assess what is going on with debt. And exactly because of this, it opens up the door to a whole set of monitoring entities to scrutinize what states are doing around debt. This has been the case already in connection to taxation, to public spending, where there are a bunch of entities, mostly within the UN, but also within regional human rights systems, trying to control how governments behave. And the standards they apply are very broad, but they're very significant, and they sometimes help governments guide their action towards more equitable outcomes. There's a book recently published with Juan Pablo Bohoslavsky, the former independent expert on debt and human rights, where we contributed and we tried to make the argument that the inter-American system has a debt on dealing with debt, and show ways in which these entities could start scrutinizing states so they're held accountable for what they do in connection to sovereign debt. And the second bucket of reasons connects to shifting the conversation beyond financial metrics. So human rights allow us to see that the debt debate is not only between creditors and debtors, but also involves the rights of the populations of the debtors state. And in fact, it gives priority to many subgroups in those populations in budgetary allocations, for instance. So by bringing a human rights face to the conversation, we can broaden the discussion, engage new stakeholders, and work on shifting the narrative around debt. And I'm an Argentine national. It's a country that is systematically indebted. I would very much be able to tell you this that for any Argentine person, knowing the name, the face, and the ideas of the IMF managing director is much more familiar than knowing the name of their Ministry of Education, because they understand that the impacts in their real lives is much more significant, even when they're not an elected official of their country. So this is very much of a human rights issue. And I'm sure many people from indebted countries could relate to that. So I don't have time to go through all the standards we chose as relevant for this exercise. I'll just provide a couple examples and close with our institutional proposal to make these principles a reality. I would just like to note that the standards we choose come from the core human rights treaties of the UN. So they are widely ratified, but most countries of the world, with very limited exceptions. One of these standards is that of minimum essential levels of social and economic rights. And what does this standard tell us? That countries have very, very core obligations, which are not too bold, but protect things like access to affordable education, to primary health care, to water and sanitation. And these obligations have been interpreted as non-derogable. They apply even in context of crisis. So what does this mean for a restructuring? The restructuring process should ensure that at the very least sufficient fiscal resources are freed up and allocated to serving these needs. Similarly, for debt sustainability analyses preceding the restructuring process, the need to finance at the very least these minimum essential levels should be taken into account systematically. Unfortunately, data shows that this does not happen, as there has been found to be no correlation between the level of crisis preceding a restructuring process and the write-offs after the restructuring process. Indicators relevant to that, which are essential to the minimum core obligations, include unemployment, poverty levels, and so on and so forth. There's also a broad legal principle of good faith. It's not a human rights principle, but it does relate to states' duty to cooperate internationally to realize human rights, which is a core human rights principle. And this has many implications for debt restructurings, obviously, including the need and the duty to negotiate once a debt becomes unsustainable. It also would include a claim to limit the enforceability of claims that do not abide by the good faith principle. And of course, the duty to cooperate internationally, and this applies broadly across international cooperation process, calls for a state with a capacity to do so, to provide technical assistance with those in a need for that, to leverage to level the playing field. In the paper, we discuss other principles, including transparency, participation, and accountability, like the core procedural warranties in human rights. This call for a broad range of measures in connection to restructuring. Probably the most well-known one is the need to conduct human rights impact assessments that include gender assessments of the outcomes or potential outcomes of our restructuring. We discuss equality and non-discrimination, the right to development, and finally, the right of peoples to self-determination and state sovereignty. So under international human rights law, the peoples of each nation should freely pursue their economic and social development. And this has huge implications in how it has been interpreted for restructuring process. First, and most obviously, this would require for an independent mediator in restructuring process. States should also be free to decide when to start a process and have the right to be able to start the negotiations independently. And then exceptions to sovereignty should be interpreted in a restrictive manner, which does not mean that we need to go back to the strict doctrine of state immunity, but also that we should not abide by very, very expansive readings of the limitations of state sovereignty, for instance, some that are made under domestic law by domestic courts. Quick note before going to the last point we make on the paper. This is a framework that is particularly relevant for states who are the natural duty bearers of human rights, but it's not only relevant for states. So states cannot forget they have human rights obligations when they act as part of international organizations. And arguably, international organizations as subjects of international law have themselves some duties of this nature. The same is true for private actors, which have some responsibilities, even if not like accountability subject obligations in connection to debt. This would apply both to debtors or, to creditors or credit rating agencies. So to conclude, how do we think in this paper that these principles could be brought to practice? Well, we argue that we need a mechanism or some infrastructure that is able to apply these principles, that we need a statutory regime and not a market-based or contractual-based approach, but a systematic mechanism that can address these concerns and incorporate these principles in a systematic way. And we argue for a mechanism of this sort to be developed and held in the United Nations. We understand that this is not a perfect institution, but among the institutions we have in the world currently, it does have universal membership. It is a democratic space. It is unbiased in the sense it's not a creditor itself. And it has a broad mandate that would allow to incorporate development, climate, and human rights consideration across the approach to solving debt crises. And we think this is not too idealistic because we are seeing how this is unfolding in connection to tax. Currently, the UN is negotiating a UN Convention on Tax Cooperation, which seemed, well, too ambitious some years ago, and now it's happening. Unfortunately, it's happening largely to the leadership of African countries who leverage the power of South-South cooperation, or of South cooperation, to change the rules. There are many learnings of that process that could be replicated in a similar process in connection to debt. The terms of reference for that convention currently include a need to align cooperation in the convention with human rights. So it's not too crazy what we are saying in the paper. It's just really similar to what is already going on. And the fact that the G20 has a South African presidency right now, and the countries are committing to some relevant and aligned commitments in the next Financing for Development conference in 2 months in Sevilla is also promising and probably leads the way forward for reform. I have 1 minute spare. I will give it to my colleagues because I just finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maria, for that insightful presentation. It really helps us to rethink how we approach debt restructuring, and not only as a creditor-debtor conversation, but also to think about countries' obligations to fulfill their human rights. And as the people of the world, we should advocate for that. The next presentation will be by Penelope Hawkins, and I will just project here for you as you come up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a lovely privilege to be here, especially in the South African Embassy. So thank you very much for the invitation. I've been asked today to talk about a borrower's platform and why we think this adds to the discussion and the possible shall we say, toolkit for solutions going forward. I think perhaps it's useful if we can just set the scene a little. Already Maria has mentioned how countries are defaulting on their development. The way we see this is through crises not of their making. The extreme weather events, climate shocks, global crises, have seen debt levels rise, and particularly debt servicing levels soar. Now, we see that at the same time, countries have really struggled to service their debts as global growth has been very sluggish and export earnings have not recovered in many cases, even from COVID. What we'd like to say is that debt, of course, is necessary for development. And so getting development back on track needs to have appropriately scaled and priced development finance. I think it's also very important that we acknowledge that the extent of the problem is much worse than is commonly acknowledged. We know that we often talk about the 35 poverty reduction and growth trust eligible countries that are currently in high or at so high risk of or at debt distress. But the problem that we think is part of that is that at least 75% of those countries have been stuck in this position since 2012. So this is a bit like Hotel California. You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave. And the other thing, of course, is that we want us, you know, it's necessary that we consider that when we think of the Poverty Growth and Reduction Trust countries, who of course are very important and very vulnerable, there are a whole range of additional developing countries that are currently have seen their public debt and external debt positions deteriorate in the years from 2017 to 2023. And so we need to be aware that this is very widespread. We think it's really important that we use this moment to think about how to shift from the capacity that countries have to repay their debt to include the ability of those countries to develop their people and their economies. Just a few pictures on Africa's external dynamics. What you can see, of course, is that the exposure to external debt has increased dramatically from 2010 to around about 1.2 trillion in 2023. The important thing, though, I think, is this little graph at the bottom of this slide, which shows you how the cost of servicing debt rose by around 412% over this period, double the rate of growth of the debt stock. So this is not about a continent that is gorging on debt. This is about a continent that has a certain level of debt, but the costs of servicing that have grown out of all proportion, and as we've said, for reasons beyond the control of the continent. We can also see how variable and volatile the rates of interest are for private lending versus official lending, which is the blue line below. And you can see here this real concern that interest costs averaged between 4.2% per annum, but rose sharply in 2023. We also know that this graph, however we are able to produce it today, is going to get a lot worse. If we just look, for example, at the period between the 1st of January and the 5th of April this year, African frontier market economies experienced a massive increase in their median yields. They increased by 46%. And so we can see that these interest rates are going to rise even further. We also know that the sovereign credit rating system is not working for African countries. Of the 29 countries with sovereign credit ratings in 2024, which of course is only a subset of the 52 countries, 28 had sub-investment grade ratings. So we can see that this lack of investment rating has negatively affected them. And then just here to see how 82% of all African countries for which we have data, you can see how their external debt has deteriorated. It's perhaps not very clear on this graph, but there is a 45-degree curve here, and all the countries to the left of that curve, which is almost 1 billion people, live in countries where there's been a deterioration. And we can also see that the deterioration, of course, is the worst for this particular group of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And here you can see the share of countries that have experienced deterioration. The public sector debt sustainability of African countries has also worsened. And again, here you can see a very similar graph between 2017 and 2023. So why would we say that a borrower platform matters in this environment? Well, UNCTAD has been arguing for a long time that it's high due time that we have a collection of borrowers who coordinate their positions, who share experiences, and who actually provide a mechanism of support and education for fellow borrowers, given, of course, that there are many creditor clubs, but no permanent borrower club. We see that this is really about making the system more inclusive. We know that it's very important that ultimately, although we're not sure when, that quota system of the Bretton Woods institutions is improved. But the Borrowers Club is a key part of that inclusivity. And in fact, one might say that there is more potential for success of the Borrowers Club than right now in this current political context of a quota change. We think that this is really important because it increases the participation of developing countries in the governance of the global financial architecture, and that it provides a counterbalance to this asymmetrically stronger creditor coordination. We think a collective voice is really important. providing additional impetus for new appropriate criterion for eligibility to development-oriented finance, and could create the mechanism to challenge the current income thresholds. We also think it's a key mechanism of peer learning and experience exchange. We see that this is something that should take place as a consistent and permanent measure, not as something that only is convened in times of crisis, and that this should allow for learning about innovative instruments and developing investor pipelines. And finally, we think it's about a knowledge repository, bearing the right to keep institutional knowledge. For some years and at different times, UNCTAD has called for a global sovereign debt authority. And one of the key parts of that authority is that it would provide this repository of knowledge. Because the reality is that countries experience this crises at different times, and very often the government involved in that experience is new. It's their first time. And so they arrive at this position without any support. One of the things that we've recently been doing in UNCTAD is working with the Secretary General's expert group on debt, which was announced in December 2024, and created a panel comprising South Africa's own Trevor Manuel, Mahmoud Muhaldin, Paolo Gentiloni from the EU Commission, and Yan Wang, a scholar at Boston University. And one of the pieces of work that we've been doing as UNCTAD is to really look at a kind of a logical frame to say, what are we trying to achieve with the work of this panel? And so our goals really has been to examine things like reducing the level of existing debt, reducing the cost of existing debt, and lowering the cost of new financing, as well as, of course, increasing the provision of that new financing. And so in order to think about this, what we've done is we've thought about the goal, we've thought about the outputs, the target interventions, and policy proposals. And you might see that if you work back, I'm sorry that the size is slightly small, but if you work back from reducing the level of existing debt, for example, which would include timely and ordering debt restructuring, including the common framework improvements, improving legal frameworks and comparability of treatment, as well as the reprofiling of debt through such new instruments as debt swaps, all of those lead you back to the possibility of a role for the Borrowers' Club. And the same exists for reducing the cost of external debt and lowering the cost of new financing. So we see this Borrowers' Club or platform as really key. We know that there are challenges. We know that there is the stigma of a debtor cartel, the notion that probably the credit rating agencies will put you on a downward watch should you join one of these debtor cartels. And of course, we know that historically, we don't have great examples of long-term existing creditor cartels. And those who had experience in the 1980s in Latin America will be able to tell you about some of the reasons why the Cartagena group failed to exist long-term. But it did have some influence. And I think that there is increased motivation and possibility for actionable common influence to develop such a thing. So we think that there is potential for this, and we think it needs to start with regular discussion and cooperation. And then finally, if I may just highlight some of our recent publications as UNCTAD, all available on our websites. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Penelope, for that presentation on a framework or maybe action towards forming a more institutional framework towards the Debtors Club. Now, we're going to have the presentation by Marina, which looks at the G20 and the external debt service burden in Africa. I will project for you, Marina, while you come up. That's okay, right?
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for IJ, our partners in this project, for the South African Embassy for hosting us today. I'm going to present this paper that actually it's a joint work. Many co-authors, one of them is Kamal here sitting in the front from IJ. Also, Patrick Najori, former central bank from Kenya, Kevin Gallagher, and Ricardo Dorsey was one of the co-authors. So in this paper, we try to look a little bit on what are the flaws of the current structure for restructuring debt, which is the common framework, and what is the impact of that burdens for Africa. So this is the two goals that we look in this paper, which we name Diverting Development, the G20 and external debt service burden in Africa. We actually are calling Divergent Development because we recognize that Africa has a huge potential for development. It's by 2050, it's expected that Africans will be 2.5 billion people, and it's a huge continent for us to fail on development of this continent. So, going to the main point of the paper, in case this is the only slide I promise that you need to pay attention. So the key 3 points of our paper is that, as I said, Africa has an immense development potential with abundant renewable resources, fast-growing population. However, Africa's potential to development has been threatened by the heavy debt burden, which consumes significant share of revenues and exceeds the continent annual climate finance needs. So we estimate that until 2030, the annual debt service payments that external debt payments Africa is making is it's basically 135% of the continent's climate needs. So actually, Africa could be boosting their climate needs if they were not serving such high debt burden. And it's mostly because concessional, the high cost of borrowing for this continent, not necessarily the volume of that. And finally, our study show that the G20 is well equipped to address the Africa debt crisis. And this encourage countries that need that relief to actually pursuing this. So we highlight the 5 key reforms that the common framework should have. So as my colleague Penelope Hawkins mentioned, so basically we are in the situation of the Hotel California. In the last 5 years, the Africa continent is stuck in that distress. Today, there is no African country, low-income countries, that actually are low probability of that distress. All of them are at least medium probability of that distress, according to the IMF. The problem with this is that when countries are considering risky with high probability of defaulting, investments that could be boosting the continent productive capacity actually don't go to what it should be going, right? Because private sector is not going to be interested in investing in countries with high probability. Even MDBs, when the country is with high probability, they usually change for more grants, and which is less volume. So, but this comes in a scenario where developing countries need to mobilize a lot of resources for development. So according to the G20 expert group, by 2030, developing countries should be investing 3 trillion in additional resources, of which 1 trillion should be in external finance. And so basically, we are in a situation we see a debt investment gridlock, and to free this gridlock, developing countries should pursue debt relief. Regarding Africa, what we saw is that given this flawed international financial architecture, Africa is left with no option but actually default on its own development. So for instance, this figure shows the trade-off, the changes between how much Africa is spending on education between 2008 and 2023, and how much they are spending in interest payment, just interest payment without looking to amortization. And we see a clear tendency that when interest payment increase, there is a crowding out of investments, for instance, in education. So today, on average, African nations are spending 24% more on interest payment than on healthcare. According to our data, for the 49 countries that is data is available, 30 of them allocate more debt service than on public health. And as I mentioned earlier, on average, debt service will account up to 2030. Africa debt service will account to 137% of Africa annual climate financing needs. So we see while Africa is not defaulting on its debt, they are defaulting on development. And this is the key problem. Recently, so this is my third spring meetings, and every time that I come to spring meetings, I heard that everything is going to be fine very soon. It's actually not happening, and I also heard, first time that I presented a paper on that, people were saying, this is just fine, in 2 years, we are going to be on the highway for development. I don't think we are, and especially now with tariffs, growth is actually lower, expected to be lower. And something that I have heard as well is that the common framework is working. And countries are actually not applying to the common framework because, that the stress is not happening. So up to now, only 4 countries have applied to the common framework: Ghana, Zambia, Chad, and Ethiopia. But in our view, actually, they are not applying not because there is no debt distress, but because the common framework have 5 key flaws. First, it is slow with prolonged negotiations, and especially when it's case by case, everything becomes more complicated. 2, when countries finally apply to the common framework, there is minimal relief. And actually, countries are back, they are not in a space to actually allow them to increase the spending on development. They are just, put it in a slightly better situation. The common framework fails to ensure the fair participation from all creditor classes. And some countries, for instance, have high exposures to MDBs. They should be participating. We see that bondholders often have a very sweet deal when they negotiate. So we believe that the fail to actually ensure all participations is a problem. Also, number 4, the common framework lacks linkages between the debt relief and future development goals. And finally, it excludes countries that need debt relief. Of course, if it's not working, there is no point in expanding the eligibility. But if the common framework is improved, increasing eligibility could be important. So how to go about it? So our first point that we show in our paper, we make the case that to streamline the common framework process, first, we need to implement an automatic 2 years debt standstill. And a pause here. So that is now it's important discussion about if some countries are facing solvency or they're facing liquidity. Although this is an important debate, the problem is that we are, almost in an academic discussion, which countries is in which box. And the problem is that nobody's applying to the framework because they're saying, oh, I'm actually illiquid. I don't need to apply. What we are suggesting is that we have a common window with all countries that are, facing some kind of debt problem they are going to apply. If you actually, after 2 years, we do the analysis and you actually show that you have a liquidity problem, great, you just got a debt sustainability, debt service suspension for 2 years. So you can, easy your debt burden for 2 years and then get, back to the track. If actually after you apply, you are seen as in debt distress, then we can go through a restructuring process. But it's important that actually, if countries see an opportunity, okay, at least I'm going to have, a debt pause for 2 years, this can encourage these countries to go about. Of course, we need to care about the legal implications. So this needs to be, the standstill can be easier with official creditors, but with the private sector, it's important that it's coordination. The case of Ukraine, for instance, there was a moratorium of 2 years. So I think could be a way to go as the G20 have this communication with the bondholders to at least, avoid legal implications. And of course, push the changes in legislation, for instance, New York and the UK. It's important that, for instance, in New York, and Professor Stiglitz has been writing about it. In New York, all claims areas, bondholders can receive 9% of interest rate when bonds are in distress. This needs to be reduced. So, pushing for legislative reforms are very important. So, so having a 2 years in standstill can actually encourage countries to apply. And of course, given the fact that now the crisis is widespread, acceleration the process by doing a group negotiation instead of a case by case can actually encourage also countries to go, right? Because if you go and other countries are not, you may be seen as, the problem, but more countries go to debt relief, then this can ease the concerns about applying to debt relief. So the second key aspect that we see is that we need to enhance the debt relief envelope. For this, the reform of the sustainability analysis is key. We know that recently the IMF, the sustainability analysis for low-income countries have improved and incorporate climate risks, for instance, but we believe that more is needed. The DSA needs to address its anti-investment bias. It's important to adopt more realistic growth trajectory and also ensure that actually the debt relief efforts are sufficient. What we have seen is, for instance, Zambia, which recently restructured the debt. They are going to pay about 6% in that service, 6% of their GDP in that service, which, they are facing climate distress. They should actually be investing where is needed, not actually using 6% of GDP to pay back creditors. We also recognize that it's important to have a simple fair comparability of treatment rule. And here, what we've been suggesting is simply for creditors that charge a higher interest rate, it means that they actually price the cost of default. Hence, they should bear a higher burden of that relief. So this is the case, for instance, of bondholders. For multilateral development banks, for instance, they charge lower interest rate, concessionality parts, so they would bear a lower part of that relief. But by escalating in prices, this can be a more fair outcome. Also, it's important to recognize that different creditors have different preferences. So we are giving options to different creditors to actually participate in that relief. For official creditors, for instance, they could extend, they may have a preference to extend payments. So for instance, we have colleagues done calculations that if you extend payment periods over 10 years and reduce interest rate from 6 to 1%, this is basically the same as giving a 44% haircut. So this can be an option for official creditors that prefer reprofiling. But there are other creditors, for instance, that they prefer cash now. This is the case, for instance, of bondholders. So we are suggesting a buyback facility to speed up the negotiation with them. And for instance, for commercial banks, commercial creditors, they could have Brady bond-like arrangements where their balance sheet, the claims on their balance sheet is transforming bonds with a discount, and this can, facilitate their participation. So basically, for different creditors, we can design different types. And finally, to enable the participation of multilateral creditors, we are encouraging donors to replenish the debt relief trust fund, and also in the case of an IMF that is becoming a very large creditor, to actually sell a small fraction of their IMF gold. So last year we did some calculations about how much gold the IMF would need to actually replenish its debt relief fund. And we saw that only 4% would be needed to actually increase eligibility and also, support. And this was last year when the gold price was 2,600. Today is 3,100. So you do the math. It's much less resources needed. My last 2 points here is that we need to align debt relief with development goals. We are supporting the case for during this 2-year standstill period, countries actually, with support of NDBs, they could conduct a pre-feasibility studies of what are the areas, investment areas that is priority. So when they actually go back to their feet, there are investments that is going to support growth in the economy. So based on the national determinant contributions and the SDGs, they would identify projects that actually, after the debt relief, would be channeled to these areas. And finally, as we said, it's with a reform common framework, we can start discussing expanding eligibility. So, and of course, all debt relief is no panacea. We need to connect this with more SDRs, enhancing the global financial safety net, and also investment boost in productive areas. Just to end on a higher note, I think that is opportunities in 2025. Of course, the tariffs and low growth rates prospects is a challenging, but this year we have the Jubilee year. Today we know it's we received the sad news of the passing of the Pope Francis, but I hope that, this gives us more strength to pursue that relief, that this is the Jubilee year, that what he really wanted. This year also, South Africa president has made debt sustainability a key priority. And this year we have also 8 former African leaders having publicly, supported the idea of a comprehensive debt relief. And this is their meeting with the South African president. So, I think this is 2025 is an opportunity. It's a challenging year, but it's also an opportunity to go moving forward. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Marina, for closing on a high note. That really sort of helps us to see the possibilities that really exist in this year. And we are going to be spending the week here in Washington with a lot of policymakers. So we really need to make the call here for a common framework 2.0 in a way where we are really poking into the holes and indicating where the loopholes are and where the opportunities also lie. Right now, we're going to have a presentation from Prof. Stiglitz, who is going to provide us with reflections, insights, and contributions from the 3 papers that have been presented here and show some advice to us as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, especially because of the role of South Africa in the G20 and the opportunity that it affords for rethinking some of the issues of debt. I'm going to discuss some of the ideas that have been are being discussed by this commission. Marina referred to this year being the Jubilee, and the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences with Pope Francis commissioned this commission to look at the issues of debt. And I'm going to try to summarize some of the ideas. As already been emphasized, this is much a development crisis as a debt crisis. And I'm not going to go over what has already been said, but it is clearly not just that the countries are defaulting on their debt, but they're, as somebody put it, defaulting on development. the issue of over indebtedness is here again. Many of you may not have been thinking about these issues 25 years ago, but some of us were around when we discussed when there was the HIPC initiative, the highly indebted poor countries, where there, on the occasion of the previous Jubilee, and there was extensive debt forgiveness, and we thought, many thought that would solve the problem. But here we are with a problem of over-indebtedness again. Of course, there were some exceptional circumstances, the pandemic, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, both of which led to high oil and food prices. That was followed by inflation that led to high interest rates. And all of those led to increased indebtedness. But even before the pandemic, many countries were on the road to over-indebtedness. And as we reflect on where we are today, it should be clear that there are some fundamental flaws in the international financial markets. There are some asymmetries, in the global architecture, which disadvantage poor countries. And I just want to second what has been said about the common framework not being up to the task. And when we go to meetings where there are people from the IMF or G20 say, oh, you know, we're moving in the right direction. And that's true, it's the right direction, but at this speed, it won't, it's irrelevant in some sense. So maybe their heart is in the right place, but the pace at which they're moving is just not adequate. And the reforms I'm going to talk about, the actions, are much broader than was just discussed in the common framework, but maybe not as ambitious as was presented in the first one, where we're all supposed to sign up to a human rights perspective. I wish there were solidarity over that, but I'm not optimistic. So I'm going to be looking somewhere between a more aggressive stance than a reform in the common framework and a purely idealistic vision. Among the flaws in the international architecture, one of them has already had attention called to it, and that's the high interest rates. And let me just emphasize that there is some research that shows these interest rates cannot be justified by the default rate. It is well beyond that which can be justified. Of course, if a borrower defaults frequently, you would expect higher interest rates. But capital markets are not working the way that those who believe in markets typically assert. But there's some other problems. The first is that capital flows are pro-cyclical. That is to say, they go into countries in booms and go out of the countries exactly when they need them. And that exacerbates macroeconomic fluctuations in developing countries. And that's part of a broader issue that if you looked at the global financial architecture, it's ironically the developing countries that are in some sense bearing much of the risk. And there's a lot of risk, and much of that risk itself originates from the advanced countries. So we're all experiencing Trump risk. That's clearly a policy risk that originates, but it's not the only time. QE was a risk in global financial markets that originated from advanced countries and had very strong effects on many emerging markets like Brazil. There are climate risks, and historically it is the advanced countries that have contributed most to climate risk, although today it is the developing countries, emerging markets that have done a lot. And financial risk, example, which was the 2008 financial crisis. And finally, there are commodity price risks that we've done very little to address, and markets haven't done very well in managing those risks. So you have this irony that the developing countries are bearing the risk when it should be the other way around. And finally, there's no adequate mechanisms for debt restructuring akin to bankruptcy courts. And within every country, we recognize that contractual approaches can't resolve the issues of indebtedness. When there's over-indebtedness, we look to a statutory approach, a bankruptcy court, and we haven't created anything akin to that in the international arena. There are a couple of other aspects of the international architecture that contributes to the debt problem I just mentioned very briefly. Being poor doesn't necessarily lead to more indebtedness. If you think you're going to be poor tomorrow, if you were rational, it's not necessarily the case that you would borrow more today. But certainly being poor helps you to get. And a lot of the international framework has facilitated, has made it easier for the countries in Africa to be and remain poor. Escalating tariffs, the overall trade regime, illicit capital flows, the fact that not only small island states have become tax haven, but the United States is a tax haven. And under Trump, we are no longer enforcing the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So we want to be an active participant in corruption around the world. More broadly, there are a whole set of problems in the fundamental structures, but there are also a number of deficient institutional arrangements. The most important of which is there are agency problems on both sides. That is to say, lenders are often short-sighted and want to lend. They get their commissions, they get their money up front, and it's somebody else who has to collect it. But also borrowers have the same problem. So, and there have been insufficient efforts to curb. In some ways, the international financial institutions have contributed to the problem because they have de facto bailed out private creditors when they lend too much. And that in doing that, they encourage bad lending. They don't officially call it that, but if you look at the macroeconomic financial flows, what you're seeing right now, for instance, and for the last couple of years, is there has been a large negative capital flow out of developing countries from the private sector. And what finances that? Large capital inflows from the international financial institutions, the MDBs. So indirectly, the international community is giving money to developing countries, which is then giving money back to the private sector. And that has happened repeatedly. They know that, and so they lend, knowing that in one way or another, they'll be helped. The debt restructuring and even assessing the level of debt has become more difficult because there is a much richer set of creditors and associated with the growth of securitization and China coming in as a major creditor. There are a whole set of contingent liabilities that have now grown into the billions of dollars. The worst are the ICSIC suits. These are the suits on the investor state suits under investment agreements that are in the billions of dollars. And they are a real worry for going forward. Countries didn't realize they had these liabilities when they signed up for these investment agreements. I have to congratulate South Africa. It took the lead, I think about a number of years ago, in getting out of these agreements. But relatively few countries have followed South Africa's lead. And Brazil has shown that having these agreements does not lead to more private capital flows. So then the credit rating agencies have had outside and perverse effects. The point that was already raised, giving low credit ratings has effectively raised the cost of capital. There's a lot of talking. You'll hear a lot more in the next 3 days about 4 days, and blended finance. The private sector loves blended finance because the more blended is, the lower the interest rates, the more risk assumed by the public sector and the more money they make. So blending has always, like the PPPs, the private-public partnership, has always meant the public sector takes the risk and the private sector gets the gain. So it's a good partnership from the perspective of the private sector, but it means that scarce public money is not being targeted. The contractual provisions, we'll call collective action clauses. Many people back in 10 years ago thought they were going to solve the problem. There clearly were, again, a step in the right direction, like the common framework, but clearly not enough to address the debt problem. And there's a problem that has become apparent in some of the cases in debt restructuring. When you have people entering the bargaining room, the creditors enter the bargaining room, lack of transparency means you don't even know whether their creditor's interest is in having a default. And that's because of the growth of derivatives and credit default swaps, which mean that the creditors may have divested themselves of all of the risk, and yet they still have voice. And there is no process for transparency to make sure that they even have skin in the game, or at least skin in the game that reflects their bargaining power inside the room. So I'm going to talk about now some ideas that we are discussing for resolving current debt crises. Steps forward that we think that would be step forward. It's not a complete list, but it's at least some. One is there need to be common principles, and I think the idea of that was discussed of bargaining together when there are enough commonality, it makes a lot of sense. It's like class action in lots of other categories. But in many cases, there are big differences among countries, and you will have to have country-specific bargaining, but try to refer to common principles. There were a set of common principles, and I appreciate the reference to the principles that were adopted by the UN almost unanimously. It just so happened that I think there were 6 countries that voted against, happened to be the 6 important creditor countries. And so, but there are principles which I think everybody would agree to behind a Rawlsian veil of ignorance. It was only that special interest clouded the view. The second one is no more net transfers out of debt distressed countries, and avoiding the bailouts by the international financial institution. This is the point I just made, that we've been financing. The international financial institutions have been giving money to countries to pay the private creditors. There's an important point here related to the distinction or the difficulty making the distinction between illiquidity and insolvency. And that is the following. In principle, a country that is illiquid and could get financing at reasonable terms would be able to repay the debt. Now, obviously, if everybody believed that and capital markets worked perfectly, then somebody would lend and the liquidity problem would not be there. So there's a close link between illiquidity and insolvency. But some people have calculated, done the following calculation. They said, if the private creditors were willing to lend at reasonable interest rates, an interest rate the World Bank lends at plus a little bit extra, would these countries be solvent? Would they be able to make their debt payments? And the answer is, for a vast majority of the countries that are in distress, they could make those payments. So in other words, a reprofiling in which the private creditors recognized that there was a reprofiling which restored them to debt sustainability and therefore lowered the interest rate would work. The unfortunate thing is the private creditors are never willing to lower the interest rates. They want debt sustainability and they want high interest rates. And they also believe that markets work perfectly. So you square that circle and you can get a Nobel Prize. So the point is that if there were good faith bargaining, I think a lot of the problems could be resolved, but I don't see that anytime soon. The third point is put in there strongly by some people from Argentina, which is in politically motivated lending. You may have noticed that Argentina, who owes $44 billion and not able to repay that $44 billion, just got a massive, was it $22 billion from the IMF. Now, that's a lot of money, and obviously Zambia would have liked that. A lot of other countries would have liked it and would have solved all of Africa's problems, I think. Why did it get that money? Well, we all know the answer. It was politically motivated lending. But the IMF denies that. One way of dealing with this is ensuring lending and debt restructurings are transparent and have broad societal support. And one way of doing that is to make sure that they are ratified by Parliament. It doesn't ensure it, but at least increases the likelihood. For those who are countries that are deeply restructured, there has to be deep principal reductions. And for other countries, long extensions of maturity and a reduction of interest rates And this entails extending and expanding debt suspension initiatives. One critical piece in debt restructuring is assessing what does it mean for debt to be sustainable. And that's supposed to be a technical exercise, but it turns out it's a technical exercise with a lot of assumptions, and those assumptions may have non-technical aspects to them. I've just listed a few aspects of that. For one is to recognize that the nature, the depth of the debt restructuring affects growth. Growth affects what that can be repaid and whether debt is sustainable. So often growth projections are made independent of the debt decisions, and you can't do that. Similarly, climate vulnerability is part of the risk, particularly if you're a small island state. And if you're doing debt sustainability, you have to include climate. One of the aspects of debt sustainability has to be, in one way or another, as I say, taking into account growth dynamics. And one of the things we should have learned is extreme austerity, which has been a part of a lot of the programs, do just the opposite. And so what we saw in country after country, that didn't work. Not only in developing countries, but in Greece, for instance. People in Europe are cheering that Greece is finally, 15 years after the crisis, getting back to its per capita income that it had 15 years ago. I don't know if I call that a success. And its per capita income, and much of it still owes a lot of money to foreigners, so that standards of living are actually lower, health is lower, and so forth. Let me go through just a few of the other important points. Establishing a fund for the repurchase of debt. And that was sort of one of the points that was just mentioned. One of the easy ways of reducing debt burden is to purchase bonds that are selling for 30 cents or 20 cents on the dollar. You can't announce that you're going to buy all the debt, because then the price will go up, but it can make a dent in the amount of debt that's outstanding. There are some broader reforms of the multilateral lending and financial system that a lot have been talked about. I won't talk about any except the last one, that the institutional environment affects debt sustainability. And one aspect of the institutional environment is the regulations for capital outflows. And so, for instance, one of the things that happened in the earlier politically motivated loan from the IMF to Argentina and the Macri government is they made a decision to allow an outflow of money. And what did that do? It meant that all the wealthy people in Argentina took the money and used it to take money out of the country. And then, of course, the exchange rate eventually fell. So the IMF had actually funded the outflow of money, leaving Argentina with $44 billion of debt, and leaving the wealthy people in Argentina much wealthier with their money abroad. Well, amazingly, the IMF celebrated that they had done just the same thing in this new loan. They obviously haven't learned the lesson, even after they had a report from their own institutional oversight talking about how they had made mistakes before. This is something that we've been working on in New York State, and people in London have been working on. A very large fraction of all the loans go from UK and New York State. And there are three key ideas. One is curbing predatory litigation by vulture funds. For those you know, technically it's called the Champerty provision. It's very likely that we'll get a provision on that. The second one is they pay 9% interest on what's called prejudgment interest until there's a resolution. There's a 9% interest rate on debt outstanding, interest outstanding. And of course, with that interest rate, that's more than you can get on any other investment. So why would anybody resolve a debt? It's the best investment you can have is to draw out the litigation. And the final thing is comparability of treatment. The private sector often drags its feet, hoping the public sector will make a debt agreement, and then they will take advantage of that. And so there's a provision that being discussed, may not go through this year, on comparability of treatment, that the private sector can't get any better terms than the public sector. Let me go on to some big reforms that I think are really important. One is creating international bankruptcy court. The second is better macroeconomic coordination, with the dominant countries taking into account the externalities they impose on smaller countries. The central banks in the United States and Europe set the global interest rates without taking into any account the effects on other countries. The third is commodity price stabilization schemes, or at least better risk-sharing mechanism, because one of the problems of facing, as I mentioned in the beginning, facing developing countries is that right now they bear disproportionate risk. The fourth is something that's really important, is more extensive use of special drawing rights. Special drawing rights are the money that the IMF can create. It can be used in very many different ways to stimulate global aggregate demand, to finance climate investment, to help finance buybacks of debt. That was used, $600 billion issuance was used during the pandemic. It wasn't optimally used, but it was still of enormous benefit. And finally, I think reconsidering odious lending, that odious lending is lending the country that lenders shouldn't be made, loans that shouldn't be made like to corrupt dictators that democratic governments then have to repay. And that would at least curb agency problems from the lender side. So a few just concluding comments. In the absence of a global legal framework, the possibility of just debt resolution depends in large part on the will of the most powerful to act with solidarity. If we do reform the system itself, we will continue to reproduce. If we do not reform the system, we will continue to reproduce the very dynamics that led us here. The international financial architecture must be redesigned, not only to enable just and efficient debt resolutions, but to create sustained access to financing needed for inclusive growth, climate, and structural transformation. But let me say, it's not just access to debt. Part of the problem, what we're seeing is over-indebtedness or not debt going in the right way to the right place. Final 2 points, debt is only one pillar of a global economic order that has become fragmented, extractive, and inequitable. If we are to achieve lasting peace and shared prosperity, we must reform the entire architecture of the global economy, its rules for taxation, for trade, and for the creation and diffusion of knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that insightful presentation, giving us the micro and macro elements into debt restructuring. Colleagues, I would like to really apologize. We thought that we would have a question and answer session, but I'm a bad moderator, so I didn't keep the time. But Prof Stiglitz and our panelists, Penelope, Marina, and María, will be around here. We have refreshments after this session, so I would really, really encourage us all to engage in discussions post this formal session that we have here. Right now, I'm going to call on Kamal Ramburuth, who is our project lead at the IEJ, to give the closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mzwa, and again, apologies that we're not going to have a Q&A now. But just to summarize everything and bring it all together, I think María did a really good job of reminding us that sustainability conversations need to interlock with conversations around human rights, and that human rights offer a stable normative framework to approach the debt debate. And while it might seem slightly idealistic to some extent to be discussing human rights in the context of financial management, I think that there's a key way in which we need to understand human rights as something that is embedded within all of us. And it's something that we can't, it's the bare minimum that is kind of required when we think about fiscal consolidation and austerity measures. It's not something that we can forget. States have this minimum core responsibilities that we can't forget when debt distress comes knocking on the door. Penelope took us down a path to consider the importance of debtors clubs and debtors platforms for coordination to improve the participation of global South countries in the international financial architecture, to reduce existing debt stocks, to reduce the cost of capital, and to reduce and to lower the cost of new financing. Marina then outlined quite clearly challenges to the common framework and took us through a range of targeted policies to deal with each shortcoming. If we ignore these challenges and these proposals, we will continue to divert development. On behalf of the Institute for Economic Justice, I extend our deep gratitude to you. Thank you to our esteemed panel and our excellent moderator for this rich discussion. I would like to thank all staff at the Institute for Economic Justice and DERCO who are here, who have put in huge amounts of hard work behind the scenes to make this event the success that it is. Finally, thank you all for taking the time on Easter Monday to join us here. Your commitment to seeking and pursuing economic justice is inspiring. In moments of uncertainty and fear like that which we are facing now, we need your inspiration and your bravery. Now, as you enter the embassy, you would have seen the towering figure of Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. And, you know, as I walked in, I was reminded of a saying that comes from Tata Mandela, where he reminded us that courage in moments like this is not the absence of the fear, but triumph over it. Brave people are not those who do not feel afraid, but those who conquer that fear. Thank you and good night. Refreshments, dinner, it's at the back. I hope you all enjoy. There's some beer and wine and beer to enjoy. Thank you.